Hello. Yes. Okay. Should we get going?
Yeah.
Thanks for being here. I'm Michelle Kambasha. My main job is being a music publicist, entertainment publicist, but I also do writing on the side for the likes of The Guardian and Galdem, specifically about culture. We have Steph Phillips over here from the band Big Joanie, and an amazing journalist. Do you want to say more about yourself?
Sorry?
Do you want to say more about yourself?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm a journalist, a musician. I'm part of a collective called Decolonise Fest, which organises a London-based festival that celebrates people of colour in the punk scene. And I've also just released my first book called Why Solange Matters, which is out on Faber and is about Solange Knowles.
And Jess Kangalee over here is radio plugger and also part of the Black Music Coalition.
Hi everyone. As Michelle said, I have my own radio plugin company called Good Energy PR, and we prioritise a majority of POC and queer artists. And then aside from that, I work alongside the Black Music Coalition independent arm, as well as advising a bunch of different independent companies in music and trade bodies on diversity in the sector.
So very illustrious careers here. And so basically this panel is just going to be about what the year has been like since Blackout Tuesday and what has done well, what things we might need to go further with, and generally like a bigger sort of wider scope in how we think about the initiatives that have spawned out from that day of collective action, really. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Steph. So in the past year, of course, you've written for a number of publications before Blackout Tuesday, but you've done quite a lot of reporting on the outcome, including an article for The Guardian. I wanted to ask you about what you thought your findings were from that day and a year on.
So yeah, I think it was interesting to look at it kind of a year on, and I think there were positives and negatives. There were positives in terms of people seemed very energized to actually kind of make real change. The UK music industry has kind of always been lagging behind when it comes to diversity and actually kind of considering that or kind of even talking about that. But there were kind of steps in place that wouldn't have happened before. So a lot more of all of the major music labels kind of created these new roles, which are more or less kind of like a diversity task force, which will, I guess, do as much or as little as a diversity task force can do, but it's a lot more than has been done before. People seem to be kind of really enthused about the idea of kind of collecting data and collecting statistics about kind of what's actually going on and how much people are getting paid, what it's actually like for people emotionally working in kind of majority white industries. But then there are also kind of the negatives of that, how long is this going to last and how are we going to keep the pressure up and what's the real outcome of, this, considering it's an industry that's always been built on kind of the back of people of colour and kind of exploiting people of colour. So how can we change the industry properly when it's kind of it was birthed the way that it was birthed.
And to touch on that point as well, this isn't the first sort of form of collective action that's ever happened in the music industry before. You had lots of stuff happen from Rock Against Racism, which was spawned from racist comments made by Eric Clapton, and you've had lots of Love Music, Hate Racism, for example. A lot of it has been kind of initiated or actioned in a live performance kind of way. But what do you think is different about this time? I know you mentioned that there seems to be a lot more surveying, but do you think, what do you think will come from that? I know that's a big question, but...
I mean, it's hard to say, because I tried to kind of gauge, why is this time supposedly different? It's not even like the first time there was, the Black Lives Matter movement that happened kind of 5 years ago, but then we needed the second wave of Black Lives Matter and the second waves of everything that's come across for there to be kind of actual change. And there wasn't really any particular consensus. It just seemed that people thought that enough was enough, that they'd kind of taken too much in the industry and that there kind of was the need to change. So I think it kind of depends. I think that there's a lot of pressure and people kind of expect a lot, but as someone that's kind of been around the music industry or kind of adjacent to it for over a decade now, it's hard to imagine it changing as much as it needs to. So it's kind of, my question is, I guess, kind of how are we going to put on that pressure and who's going to do it and who's going to keep an eye on them?
Yeah, and I think we talked about it just briefly before we came on, but on Thursday, and I know you worked on this, Black Lives in Music released the first survey of its kind, which asked black people their occasions of racism that had happened to them, and 63% of performers specifically commented on how they'd experienced racism, and this went up when it came to music executives or people that work sort of behind the scenes to something like 73%, I think, but don't quote me on that. But the whole report is amazing anyway, but I just wanted to know what it was like sort of working on that and helping to report on that.
Yeah, sure. So I kind of worked on kind of collecting stories from kind of music executives, musicians, I think it was a few lawyers, kind of people adjacent to the music industry, to see kind of what their experience was emotionally and how working in the music industry had affected them, and also kind of what are the problems and what do we need to change. And so there kind of were a lot of stories of, you know, blatant racism, people that had worked in executive levels in record labels, you know, hearing colleagues say the N-word and kind of constantly being dismissed and constantly be giving smaller budgets for artists that are black or brown. So there were kind of a lot of those kind of stories. There are also kind of, you know, stories of musicians who felt marginalized because of their race, and it was harder to kind of pinpoint why that was happening and how it was happening. But, you know, they would get, less kind of billing, lower billing on whatever gig they were playing. They get less attention from the media, from their labels. And so kind of there were a lot of stories like that. And it was, it kind of reaffirmed what I already knew about the industry and what I already expected.
I think people would be quite surprised to know that that's the first kind of study of its kind in terms of sort of working out the emotional baggage that comes with working in the music industry if you are black or brown. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's something that has spawned from Blackout Tuesday in some ways. I'm not sure if it was in progress before, but I think in some ways at least there'll be more eyes on it and more of an understanding, you'd hope, I think. Jess, so you are a radio plugger. You've worked in plugging for how long now?
10, 11 years.
Yeah, and you're also part of the independent arm of Black Music Coalition. Which was also founded in the wake of Blackout Tuesday and George Floyd. What kind of initiatives have you been trying to work? And I guess because it's sort of led by music executives who are trying to take more of a top-down approach, how have you found that in this year? And do you feel that you're able to action some of your objectives with the help of the labels that you're working with? How fluid has that process been in sort of putting those things into action?
So I'm just going to give a bit of backstory to Black Music Coalition. Essentially, it was founded by 5 women that work across the major labels. And in terms of the wider committee, it was very major label heavy. A few people that work in the independent sector got in touch with the committee, and we really felt the need to establish an independent specific arm because for various reasons. Michelle and I used to work together. You, the first woman of colour I saw in 5 years into my career in our sector, and because the independent sector generally is, more spread about. There's not necessarily easy access to people, like-minded people, whereas the majors are essentially all in the same buildings. We wanted to kind of firstly establish a Black network in the independent sector so we could start creating community, which is generally important for support and networking and, things along those lines. But also we really felt that in the major sector where there was a lot more awareness of race issues, it really didn't exist in the independent sector, specifically the bigger labels and music companies. I think the way that we've been looking at it is trying to really, there was a big a big section of education that needed to happen, because from my perspective, when we started having these conversations in the wake of Blackout Tuesday, the level of knowledge of what was going on was not, there was not a lot of awareness, essentially. And, you know, the varying level of involvement or what each company had been trying to do goes from nothing to making some sort of an effort, being slightly misguided, actually putting in a lot of effort in terms of supporting community projects or looking at their hiring processes, or like support internally for staff, or providing mental health support. But it is a bit of a slow process, because it does feel like, because there is less representation across the indie sector, in terms of the bigger companies, we're kind of starting from zero and building that up. In terms of like the general process, I think it's just been a bit slow, purely because, as I said, like trying to kind of educate from where nothing already exists, to getting people on the same page with how we think that they should be engaging with anti-racism. It just takes a while, and you know,
of course.
The indie community is just haphazard generally in terms of organisation. So,
and I guess in some ways, some of the benefits or the things that draw people towards the independent sector can also be some of the things that you struggle with when trying to implement sort of concerted and organic and amalgamated change, like all together kind of thing. Do you think this might be sort of based on a sort of stereotype of the kind of person that works in the independent sector, but do you think that because people that work in independent music are thought to be more, in some ways, benevolent and caring and very liberal, I'd probably say so more so in independent than some majors. And that kind of stems from the idea that it's music forward, it's artistry forward, so it kind of leads you to kind of thinking that they'll just naturally connect with your values. Do you think that that's partly the reason why it can be a bit slow to change? Like, because they're a bit like, well, because I think this way, then I'm being anti-racist. Yeah.
That's like such a...
Yeah.
There's a few points to that. I'd say part of it is, I think the biggest part of it is time. You know as well as me, having worked in like indie label world, that it's just really busy all the time, and trying to find the time to, put these initiatives into practice, it's just generally difficult. There is definitely a part of it where people feel like they have this holistic artist first approach, so sometimes they're not necessarily aware of where they might be falling short. Something that has been said to me by a few different labels is, oh, well, our black artists haven't said anything and we've asked them. But I'm like, well, the thing is, it might not be the environment where they feel they could say something to you. There's a lot of qualitative feedback people need to take into consideration. But my big thing for the independent sector is really looking at company culture. I think that there's you can list a bunch of things that companies can do, and I listed some earlier, to help with representation and support and progression. But the fundamental thing that does need to change is company culture, because people don't seem to realise how alienating that can be, and it could be. It really is. Rooted in a lot of unconscious bias that goes on.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned that people mentioned a lot, our black artists on our roster haven't mentioned anything. I think that's one thing that's quite interesting in the independent sector, and also I guess you can talk about this as being in a punk band, that the onus on fixing racism is put on black people, when actually it should be on the dominant force, which is sort of pervasive whiteness of the industry. And sometimes you get this this rhetoric from labels that are just like, well, we're in a rock and hard place. We don't have that many black people on our roster, so what can we possibly do to change that? And I think kind of changing that mentality is something that's become really important in the past year.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any comment on that, Steph.
Yeah, I mean, like, the independent sector is very stuck in its ways. I think there's a lot of reasons why there aren't black artists on their roster. It's not because there aren't black artists making that kind of music, or aren't black artists that would fit there. Often kind of independent labels pick artists because they look a particular way or they fit a particular mold. And kind of being in a black punk band, we don't fit any particular mold, so we can't get on a classically R&B independent label. We can't get on an indie label. We're too odd for both of them because we're not the, everyone wants the easy sell. The easy sell is whatever band fits the mold or whatever artist fits the mold. And so that's kind of often why it is that unconscious bias and an unwillingness to change, because if you change, you have to kind of like face up to what's been happening for the past, 20, 30, 40 years,
Yeah, and also I think that this happens both with majors and independent labels as well, but I think it will be something that people are looking more closely to in terms of labels' A&R process and how they can typically, a lot of indie labels use a certain image or a look of a black artist to look sort of forward-thinking and cool. I'm thinking of a few, not XL, but then they're not represented in the back, and I just wonder, that's always just seemed a little bit funny to me. I think when I came into the music industry, like especially going independent label, I would have thought that some of the labels that produce a lot of diverse or sort of put out a lot of diverse releases in terms of race would instinctually be sort of anti-racist, but actually I've heard some horror stories. Do you have any comment on that?
I have so much to say. First, one of the conversations I've been having a lot is specifically aimed at like A&Rs that get brought on to sign certain types of artists. It's more prevalent in the major scene, but obviously does happen in the independent sector. And the issue with that is once that, I'm not going to mention any specific types of music, but once that genre starts being less popular, those people that have been brought on are then discarded. They don't have the opportunity to grow or develop within the environment that they're in. That's an issue. Generally, people, as you said, it's an issue when labels sign black artists, for example, and they don't have a representative team working on those projects. Also, another thing that comes kind of along that is when people employ people of colour to make themselves seem more diverse as an employer, but then they don't have any knowledge of how to make the environment fair for those people, or how to look after, like understanding that their needs are going to be different to their straight, white, upper class other employees, do you know what I mean? And then, I'm trying not to go on a rant, but yeah, there's a lot of, and also just, picking back up on what you said earlier about having a lot of these diversity task force starting, that work is generally being done by people of colour or people within the minority. And one thing that I've been really trying to encourage labels to do is to fund that work. I don't really understand the reticence to not fund it, because essentially it's a service that is going to benefit the label in the long run, but you're now asking the people who are being affected to do extra work on top of their workload, and they are not getting anything out of it besides being emotionally drained and also physically drained because they're having to do so much.
And probably constantly triggered as well.
Exactly, because it's also just going back, sorry, I'm really ranting now, just to go back to the unconscious bias thing. I think one of the most frustrating things is having to constantly be making other people aware of what their bias is. It can feel so limiting at times because you're just you do not see the world that I see it, and I have to keep explaining to you why my point of view is valid. And that always translates in this diversity work, because that is essentially what you're doing, and you're trying to essentially convince people that your way of thinking is important, and that is just not great for anyone.
Yeah, it's tiring being the translator between two worlds, because who wants to do that?
Yeah. Do you think that I guess maybe from a major perspective, I can't remember which major it was now, but they sort of promised X amount of millions.
Was it Sony?
I think it was Sony, right?
Yeah.
And I think there was a report that came out on Noisy or something that they haven't really implemented or haven't shown how they're going to put that into
Do you mean
work.
the report from a bit ago?
Yeah, a few months ago.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, from Noisy, about where if they'd actually pledged, used the money that they'd pledged. I think it was like something like 200 million or something. I can't remember. Something like that.
It was, sorry, I don't want to interject, but I just so I'm getting facts in my mind. So a bunch of majors pledged money, and then it was a year after that it had done that, and they hadn't released any information. I think Sony now has released information, but a few of them haven't. But still, it took a year.
Yeah.
It took a year for them to like decide or, publicly share what they were doing with that money. And it's like, in my opinion, I mean, it's good that they've done that, but in my opinion, like, it's nothing like out of the ordinary. You're going to support some social justice groups. You're going to support mental health. Like, I want more information about what you're doing internally as well. Like, how are you supporting your staff that are already there? How are you looking at job retention? How are you looking at progression? How are you looking at looking after people? That's kind of what I'm more interested in about.
I think as well, using sort of Blackout Chooser as a placeholder will be interesting for years to come, because the idea of sort of black trauma being the only time that people act on these things is going to become a bit problematic. And we've seen that since the first sort of Black Lives Matter sort of protest that happened in 2014 or 15. And then for it to happen last year, and then do we always, the idea of having to be re-traumatized to make action, the idea of needing to have an anniversary to talk about these things, like, do you think that's just going to continue? I mean, I'm trying to like see if there are positives and negatives, right, to having an anniversary like this. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that. And I also wanted to link it back to your report and your findings on the emotional weight that people have had to have, and how that kind of plays into positions of seniority, junior positions. The classic, well, the thing that I can see anyway, but I don't know if there's any data to back it up, is that a lot of minorities, whether they're people of colour or other kinds of minorities, they typically leave the industry early on because they're kind of too exhausted by it. And that kind of links back to being re-traumatised and being triggered. But yeah, just any of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was kind of like my findings from kind of speaking to people that, either they had to leave because it was so stressful because of all of those things, or they were quite often kept out, and there is kind of that real glass ceiling of people kind of working so that you stay in an entry level, or so that you stay at a particular salary level, and then just hope that you get tired and kind of leave the industry. So kind of, those are kind of my findings. I think that, what was the other question, sorry?
Sorry, it was kind of, will we always need to have an anniversary, or like to see, or black trauma to see?
Yeah. I mean, I hope not, because I just don't. The thing that kind of really frustrates me is like, why do we have to die for people to get it? It's really freaky. Like, I mean, obviously, like you guys know, but like Black Lives Matter already happened. Someone already died, and then the person died, and people kept dying, and people kept saying, "Oh, this is really important. We should do something about it." And then nothing happened, and then another guy had to die. I mean, it's really kind of disorientating to kind of see that constant morbidness around black people's bodies and black people's death. I don't know. I mean, I hope that we're kind of educating ourselves and kind of going past the instinctive morbidness, but it does feel like kind of people get very caught up in the death. And then wanting to act, perform a particular emotion, and then forget about it the next day. I don't know.
Do you think, so I'm asking a question, I know I'm not supposed to. Do you think, because something I've been going back and forth with is the only reason that this was such a big moment last year because we were in the pandemic and because people could not turn away from it? And then, intrinsically with that, does that mean, that's why I kind of feel, part of me does feel that's why it was such a big impact.
Definitely. I mean, I did a kind of anniversary piece on Blackout Chooser for Galdem, and I asked that to everybody that I spoke to, and the the point of the piece was to be a bit more positive in terms of how Black people and some people of colour were making space for themselves on the margins. And I did this piece with Tiger Reid, who is she's amazing, and she did a lot of research on it. She's also studying
Rhythm and race,
but she also does she's doing a master's on something else. But my people did say that there was just no option. You couldn't turn away. You were stuck inside, and yeah, you just had nowhere to look, really. And I guess you have to just take the good with the bad in that kind of situation. I guess a lot of things did positively happen, but I don't think I want to have another pandemic for it to happen.
No, definitely not.
And also there was that really weird time of like people like offering to like give me £15, which was fab, for like a takeaway. Yeah. I was like, yeah, this is great. But that's the problem. That's the difficulty of racism and capitalism at the same time. I'm going to take the £15, but I'm not undermining patriarchy, unfortunately.
But that's why it kind of feels like it's kind of like someone kind of people working through their emotions, because it is like, you can't just pay to make racism go away.
Yeah.
Like we still have to do everyone has to do the work. Kind of, everyone in society, because we're all affected by white supremacy. So it's odd that it's like, oh, I can give you 50 quid and that will make it better.
Yeah.
Or even like, Black Lives Matter UK got £1 million in donations after kind of everything last year. And that was purely because people thought, I need something to do, I'll give money. And that's the first thing people thought, which is amazing. But also it's like, really, it's not the only thing you can do. So I hope people kind of realise that there's a lot more after kind of the donation.
Yeah. Do you think that people, I guess this has become the main kind of phrase or term that kind of came out of this sort of time was anti-racism, but do you think that people actually understand what anti-racism is? I mean, no. Because like you're saying, giving money is just one little bit of like being actively anti-racist, and I think that, of course, we live in capitalism.
It's not really actively anti-racist.
You're just giving money.
Like, it's not.
It's just doing.
Yeah, if you're giving me £15 to buy McDonald's, that's not anti-racist.
Yeah, I mean, it is just kind of trying to take part in it whatever way you can, and I do get that people were so moved by what happened that was kind of the thing that they could do, and I donated as well. Yeah. But it is about kind of, sometimes it's a lot less performative than I think people realise. It is about kind of just sitting with yourself and kind of trying to view the world from not through your own eyes, which is very hard to do. Yeah. It's about kind of like just thinking about things and being very still, and it's very hard to do that, especially with the culture that we have today, or just in this country in general. We're not really taught to how to kind of be still and how to see other people's point of view.
I think one of the things as well that got lost in how just sort of Blackout Tuesday built very, very quickly was you talk about the stillness, so how they wanted people to sit back and think about things. They weren't necessarily asking for active, overt protests, but a lot of it was to do with reading and looking at sort of tools of dismantling racism, going into the anti-racist literature, and that's really, really important to get a grounding of and to be able to truly understand it. I think that a lot of the work that has to be done to make sure it's really embedded in people to understand starts from like reading text and reading it. And I don't know if that's because my background is, I did history and philosophy, which obviously is just like research becomes a thing that you think of a lot. But I'm not saying that every company should be like telling everybody to read like Franz Fanon or anything, but how do we kind of implement the kind of understanding of the music industry actually? Like, do people know how the music industry was built? Have they read those books? Have they studied those texts? Like, probably not, but do you think it's important that they do know that?
I think it's incredibly essential that they do know that, and I think that is one thing that, we could do for free. We didn't have to do anything. We could just set up a reading group that meets once a month or something, and then kind of people share texts. You can share text online or kind of share in person. And also just kind of having, like those old-fashioned consciousness raising kind of type meetings, like from the 70s and 60s of just sharing experiences. Because I think that kind of there is like a disconnect between how different people view the world and how different people view the society. And there is kind of like there are literal, two different worlds. If you're kind of black and if you're white, and if you're brown, if you're white. And so, I do think there needs to be that coming together. And also kind of like the recognition that anti-racist activism by its own nature liberate you as well as a white person. Like there's no way to kind of actively be anti-racist and then kind of somehow kind of push yourself like to the back of the queue. That's not possible. If you're raising up kind of like one of the most marginalized people, you're going to be raising up yourself. And, the reason why we're in such a state in this country is because we've been kind of pushing everyone down.
Yeah. So in this past year, I think I've asked you this before, Steph, but in this past year, how have your immediate sort of surroundings changed in terms of your sort of people that your friendship groups, your colleagues, the people that you're around? Has it changed in any kind of way?
And in what sense?
Just in the people that you kind of have time for.
I know what you're saying.
So are you more?
Have you quelled your friendship circle?
Yeah. Is there anyone that you had to get rid of?
Oh my God.
I mean, I haven't. I think.
Have. Well, no, do you know what? No, like that's an extreme. Basically, I'm sorry, I'm just taking over. Essentially, like, I really resonate with what you said about experience sharing. It's something I've always tried to do, and response tends to be, oh, I can't believe that's happened. Like, no, this happens literally every day. Like, it's not that surprising. The hardest thing that I found is like trying to communicate the fact that people's experiences of the world are different, people's views of the world are different, and that is like really difficult for some people to ingest and like get their head around. And I think that we all kind of reach a certain point of fatigue when you're trying to kind of have these kind of conversations and then it's just not getting there.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people that I know as well have kind of had to be a bit protective about themselves. And, you can try as much as you can. It might not be working right now. It might work in the future, but it just, again, it's like, it's exhausting having to go over and over these things all the time. So it's just one of those things. But having said that, I think that it for the independent specifically and just like my general circle, it means that a lot of conversations that would have never been had have been happening. And it's really, really positive to see people's mindsets changing and people being more open and willing to understand different viewpoints of the same situations in the same world.
Cool. Yeah, I think that, I don't think I've had to quell any friendship groups. I think I did that like maybe 5 years ago.
That's what I'm just saying. Because I think when I spoke to you, like, I actually think I've got quite a good group of people around me, because I remember you mentioned that, you'd been going to lots of black feminist reading
I
groups
started going
and
to
stuff.
black feminist reading groups maybe 8-10 years ago. And that was kind of when I kind of learned a lot more about understood my own politics, understood my own kind of like sense of self, and kind of was able to bring all the parts of myself together with like grounding with people that understood me as well. So that was when I kind of like had a bit of a over time kind of was able to kind of, not like you're getting rid of people or cutting people out, but it's just like you have different kind of interests and different kind of ways of seeing the world. And I only hang out with people for the revolution, really, to be honest with you.
And I guess you've been creating space for a while with Decolonize Fest as well. So that's the kind of, you're active in kind of making space for.
Yeah. It's about, making space and making sure that there are places where people feel like they can be welcomed, and that can, that kind of liberatory politics can happen within the music scene or music industry.
I guess we all work as an umbrella term in terms of the arts industry, and it feels like in some ways for women that certain sectors have been, I'm talking film, I'm talking that kind of stuff, have been further along in terms of discussing how you might be affected as a woman in that industry. Do you think there's time coming for when we're also going to have a discussion, like another kind of Blackout Tuesday, for want of a better term, for how women are treated in the industry and how dangerous or fearful it can be for them?
That's a good question. I wonder how. I feel like, I mean, I don't know. What do you think? How often has that been discussed before?
Do you know what? Like, I think, are you talking in terms of like?
Are we going to get a Me Too?
Oh, well, we definitely need one.
Yeah.
Because we haven't, there's been like bubblings going on, but nothing has actually really hit, like blue, I don't want to say nothing's blown up, but you know what I'm saying. I think that also just within everything that's been going on, there needs to be even more emphasis put on like understanding the intersectionality within the Black community as well in music, because there's not been, obviously there, I don't want to say like what I want to say. There's things that people aren't really aware of in terms of like the Black female body, for example. There's a lot of things within the Black community in music that people aren't aware of in terms of the LGBTQ plus community and you know, transphobia. So it's not as simple as just it being a race thing. There are all these other intersectionalities within that need to be, you know, taken into account. And I feel like the next logical step, or like natural step, it's probably not natural, is that there is a Me Too moment that has kind of representation for the specific way that POC women are treated, because there's a lot of tokenizing, fetishization, and that doesn't get talked about, essentially.
And I think tokenization and fetishizing are very difficult when you're talking about when you're, especially in the music industry, when you're talking about that for Black people, because there is an exciting and freeing level of sexuality that you do find in Black music, or certain kinds of Black music. So kind of finding a way to consolidate that and make sure that it's been treated as a celebration as opposed to fetishizing. Because I'm just thinking about, like, you can just imagine people, like, especially if there are a lot of white executives discussing a Black artist that they're signing, and you know the kind of words they might use towards him. I want to be sexy, I want them to do this. And that is just a bit weird. Not that they're not sexy, but, you know, there's just a way, of tonality of talking about it, which, again, is one of those things, like, in between the lines, which is hard to kind of tell people how to...
You want someone to be able to own their own sexuality and their own way of kind of presenting themselves. But, within the wider kind of world, that's hard to kind of discuss openly. I don't know how to.
There's also, it's like that weird line between the commodification of like a Black female body. Do you know what I mean? I don't even know what that looks like, but that's like where it sits for me.
I think one thing that's interesting about Blackout Tuesday is that, I mean, the women that created them were 2 Black women, and a lot of the people that have been kind of leading the charge are Black women as well. Why do you think that is? I mean, it's a big question. The reason why I say that is because there's a lot of discussion about police brutality against Black men, even though it does happen. I mean, we know Breonna Taylor, we know Sandra Bland, but it seems like it also comes from that intersection that you're talking about, that a Black woman has to be like very, very powerful and very forthright and protecting. We are the ones that are protecting our culture. I wonder if there's any kind of sort of friction there. You know, sometimes it can feel like you have to bear a lot if you're a Black woman, and you want to, but then also you're a bit knackered as well. It's a good thing, but I guess what I'm saying is, it's amazing that we've had so many Black women come to the forefront in this past year, but is it also like a bit of a problem if other people aren't kind of taking the baton and like helping us along? I'm sure that you would have discussed that in Black Music Coalition in some capacity.
Yeah, we have. I mean, the majority of the people leading the BMC Executive Committee and also our independent committee, they're all women.
Mm-hmm.
We have discussed this, but it kind of got like shoved onto the table because it was more of a ha ha ha. Isn't it funny that this is happening again? We have some great guys involved, but it does tend to come from the driving force of women. I think there's that famous saying, and I don't know who said it, but it's like the order of how people are treated, and black women are always at the bottom.
I think it was Malcolm X.
Thank you.
I don't quote me though, but I think it was.
But yeah, I really don't have an answer for why that is the way, but I feel like just generally within like people's spirit, when they are marginalized to a certain point, they become more, I don't know, they want to kind of, there's two ways you can go essentially. You can either just recluse from the whole situation, or you can stand up and fight, and it tends to energize people more.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's what it is. I mean, also women are just better, aren't they?
Yeah, that is odd. Because like in my collective, the festival, it is also majority women. And I don't know why it is like that. I think most of the times I've been in the industry, kind of, it has been majority women. I don't know if, the only thing I worry is if for some reason black men feel less inclined to kind of go for kind of like those kind of leadership positions or kind of executive positions for whatever reason. I don't know if there's kind of like a kind of glass ceiling that's stopping people from getting there. But yeah, kind of the workload does seem to be kind of like on black women or women of colour, definitely.
Maybe, I just had a thought, like, there are more black men in like leadership positions in music than there are women, as far as I'm aware.
Oh, is that true?
Well, like, I'm just going off like some numbers that were given from a survey around Blackout Chooser. That might be different now because a lot of people did get promoted into roles.
Okay.
So maybe just ignore everything I just said. But yeah, like I feel like, you know what you said earlier about the level of racism kind of increases the higher you get. Maybe there's something in the fact that like having to progress yourself in a system that isn't necessarily is built to work against you essentially means that you're kind of just doing all you can to be where you are. And I think that also, I mean, that is not a great mentality for anyone to have to deal with, but I do think that there's something to be said of that mentality in gatekeeping as well. Yeah. Because gatekeeping is like, it's something that I just go on and on about all the time. I don't understand it. I mean, I do understand why the premise of it exists, but like, I think that gatekeeping is so harmful because the point of getting certain types of people into certain positions is that it opens up the doors for people that are coming through. And the only way that there can be true progression is if people who are higher up actually open those doors. Yeah.
I believe, so one of my interviews I did for the Galdem piece, I forget her name, but she used to work at Method Management, and she was saying, and before then she worked in another capacity in the music industry, so she's been in it for like over 15 years or something, and she was saying that every single time that she's ever had a leg up, it's always been by another black woman in a senior position, and it's not, and it seems to me, and I can't like verify this, but black women tend to gatekeep a lot less when it comes to trying to usher in more people, whatever, like in terms of like how good you are, but also they know that they're underrepresentation of black women. But again, it's like our point is that it shouldn't just be black people doing that.
Yeah.
Other white people should have an understanding that there's a problem there. And this isn't kind of, I don't want to, I can't remember the phrases now. Positive discrimination is not necessarily what I'm advocating for, but just a level of understanding and grounding that it's up to everyone, basically. So, are there any positives that we can glean from this past year?
Yes, there's loads.
There are lots.
Lisa, you take it.
I mean, it has. I mean, it's hard to be positive, but we have been talking about race and racism in the music industry in a completely different way. Like, I never thought that we'd actually be talking about race and seeing kind of major labels kind of mentioning it. And I can't remember if it was it Sony or BMG that kind of acknowledged that they'd basically exploited loads of black artists in the past and were wanting to do something to correct it. I don't think anyone kind of called them out to do that. They kind of went out of their way to kind of released that statement and kind of acknowledged that past and that what happened. So there does seem to be kind of change in the way that we want to talk about things. I would say that talking about things is one thing and then kind of doing it is another. Yeah. Which is, I don't know, what do you think?
I mean, yeah, I completely agree. I think the positive is that the conversations that I've been able to have or have been having, if I was trying to have the same conversations like 3-4 years ago, they were just going to an echo chamber. No one was interested. No one would try. No one thought it was important enough. No one tried to understand. So that is a really big step. I think my pet peeve about everything that's been going on is that there's a lot of talking and not a lot of doing. And I really believe that like there is definitely a level of education that needs to happen, a level of understanding that needs to happen, but also the point in which change starts is when those are actionable, and getting people over that line can be quite difficult. And that's what I hope will, obviously now everything's opened up again, we're in a slightly different situation. I am kind of hoping that momentum continues, because we need to start seeing a lot of actionable changes now.
And do you think that the pandemic might be a reason why it's coming up a bit slower? But I guess it's kind of a catch-22, because I'm not sure there would have been, like we were saying, as much further about it if the pandemic hadn't happened. So I guess it's a difficult question to ask. But do you think that maybe one of the reasons that it's a bit slow to change is because of that, like people's priorities are elsewhere?
I think partly, but also it's a time thing. I think like it's easy when you're being still and not able to go to a lot of places to focus harder on these things. But, you know, touring has been dead and now it's happening again, and for example, and people who maybe had time before because certain aspects of the industry weren't active, don't have the same amount of time. So it's really about trying to keep everyone going with the same momentum and keeping positive action like happening. But yeah, again, it's what you said, it's a bit of a catch-22 because like I do think it's really important that whatever people have learned or started doing during the pandemic is now they're having to kind of transfer that into how real life is. And I do think a lot more people are generally day-to-day more aware of things when they're going on. But again, it's how much can you take into your purview when you're just like really busy trying to get all this stuff done and like, you know, juggling loads of different things.
Yeah. I mean, it could be. I think the thing is, it is all doable though. And it is all possible on an individual level and also a collective and a kind of industry-wide level. It will take kind of like a change of thinking and as individuals, which is possible, and then a change of thinking of the way the industry works, which may take a few kind of like a few initiatives and a few kind of like pushes in the right direction. But there's no reason why it can't happen if people want it to happen.
I just wanted to touch on one more thing. I think we're probably running out of time. But Amo obviously couldn't be here, and he's based in Birmingham. And I wondered, because you're from Wolverhampton and you're in the process of kind of going back to that area, in terms of decentering London, how do you have any kind of sort of knowledge of Blackout Chooser's impact across the country? I know I spoke to a few things that were happening in Bristol for my piece, but I wondered if you had any thoughts on kind of regional communities that are trying to like, or maybe there's more representation in regional communities, I'm not really sure, but if you had any thoughts on that.
Not too much. I think that, I think kind of decentering London from the music industry is really essential, and kind of just because, for one, like, there's always been black people everywhere in the country. Like, there's nowhere where we aren't there. And kind of, we have the Black British community is different wherever you go, and kind of having that representation is really important. Sometimes things that are called Black British are actually just kind of like specifically South London. It's really like confusing. So I think that is kind of like something that's ongoing. I think that kind of, you know, just for the last Black History Month, you know, this month, there's been like a lot more kind of events and a lot more things going on across the country that I can see that are centering Black people, and that seem like a lot more varied than they'd ever been. So I think there's kind of like a lot of positives to come from.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's us. Yeah,
Cool.
perfect. We're doing questions or?
Ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just quickly, you spoke a little bit about it with like the bigger industry, I don't know what the correct term is, but tokenization of black people. And I just wondered what your thoughts are on sort of the circular movement, because obviously, you know, the Black Civil Rights Movement, for example, is one of the most well-known movements in history for black civil rights. And a lot of conversation came out of that, but then we're here decades later with the Black Lives Matter movement 5 years ago and then now again. And I just wondered, obviously there's going to be frustration in the black community about having to have the same conversations over decades and decades. And I know that there's change happening in the big industry, but do you feel like you mentioned sort of tokenization and sort of, I don't know if the correct term is blackwashing, but you know, making it out like they're doing something when they're not really changing. You mentioned a minute ago about conversation happening and maybe now seeing actionable evidence, but conversation has been happening for many, many, many years. And I mean, I'm speaking as a white guy, so obviously like, I don't know as much as you guys, but I just wanted to know what your thoughts are on, do you think action will happen?
I think people want action to happen, which is it's always been the way. And I think there's, I think it's always been weird because, we've always, in the UK, where there's always been kind of like anti-racist movements and there's always been things going on, but then it has been kind of a recent change where people have kind of just, kind of thought enough is enough. And I think there will be that push in every aspect of life, especially in the music industry. But then it is kind of a give and take. It does take everyone's involvement and everyone.
I think, I can't remember what writer it is, but he calls it the changing same. So like you're saying, it's a circular thing. The one thing that I find conflicting with the recurrent movement of this is that the problem is fundamentally institutional and you're not sure whether, and I don't think any of us are sure or not, whether you're able to dismantle institutionalized racism with the same tools that we're given. So that's why it ends up being a bit circular. So like I was saying, that there's kind of empty levels of tokenism, like throwing money at a problem, but it doesn't mean that people want to give up the power that they have already. And that's going to be an ongoing struggle. I don't know how to fix that. But yeah.
Is there any other questions?
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks.